So, usually when we look back at the really dark chapters of history, we kind of carry this inherent expectation of like spontaneous chaos.
Right. Yeah, like a sudden explosion.
Exactly. We picture this violent storm that just, well, it comes out of nowhere. One day the sky is perfectly clear. Everyone's just going about their daily routines, right?
Mhm.
And then the next day, boom, a violent revolution erupts and just sweeps the entire foundation away.
Yeah, I mean, we really cling to that idea of unpredictable historical collapses. It feels a lot like an earthquake, you know? We want to believe it's totally binary. Like there's a normal before and then just a completely broken after.
And it's comforting to think about history that way, honestly, because, I mean, if a disaster is just this sudden, unpredictable force of nature, then nobody could have seen it coming.
Right. It lets people off the hook.
Exactly. Nobody's really to blame for the structural failure, but then you step into the reality of how authoritarian regimes actually take power,
Yeah.
and that comforting binary picture just shatters completely.
Yeah. It really does. You start looking at these unpredictable earthquakes and you start looking at a landscape of incredibly calculated, almost clinical engineering.
Which is exactly what we're going to see today, because that is exactly what happened in Argentina between 1976 and 1983. So today we are taking a deep dive into the systemic anatomy of a military dictatorship based on our source material.
And it is a heavy, heavy topic.
It is. We're going to look at exactly how an entire society can be structurally dismantled, how it can be ruled by this very specific manufactured kind of fear, and crucially, how that society eventually fights its way back to justice.
Because the mechanics are what make this specific period so chilling. I mean, the defining feature of this regime wasn't just the sheer military force they deployed.
Right, because authoritarian regimes using violence is, tragically, a really old story.
Yeah, exactly. What stands out in Argentina is the intensely bureaucratic, almost corporate nature of the state apparatus.
Yeah, corporate is a good word for it.
Right. Like, we are talking about deep economic engineering designed to permanently alter the social fabric. We're talking about sophisticated public relations campaigns, secretly run by American advertising agencies, right in the middle of a World Cup.
It's wild to even think about.
Apocalyptic violence, heavily disguised as just, administrative order.
Now, before we go deeper into those mechanics, I want to make a very clear note to you listening right now. We are covering highly sensitive, deeply traumatic, and incredibly politically charged events today.
Very much so.
The history involves actions taken by a huge spectrum of actors. I mean, ranging from left-wing labor unions and armed revolutionary groups, all the way to right-wing conservative factions, civilian corporate collaborators, and of course the state military apparatus itself. So our goal in this deep dive is strictly to analyze and report the facts of how this system operated based on the sources. We are not here to take political sides, and we are absolutely not endorsing the viewpoints of any of the actors involved.
All right, our sole objective is just to impartially understand the mechanics of this era.
Exactly. So to understand how a nation accepts that kind of darkness, we can't start on the day the tanks rolled in, right?
No, absolutely not. To really grasp the mechanics, we have to look the exact moment the lights started flickering out. We have to examine the chaotic vacuum that made the public, in a lot of ways, desperate for order at literally any cost.
Okay, let's unpack this prelude. We're looking at 1975, and Argentina is effectively in a state of terminal decomposition.
It's a textbook example of a perfect storm.
Totally. So the monumental, gravity-defying figure of Argentine politics, Juan Domingo Perón, he died the year before, in 1974. And he leaves behind this incredibly fractured executive branch under the control of his widow, Isabel Perón.
And her administration instantly becomes the stage for an absolute systemic crisis. I mean, the defining moment of this crisis, the spark that completely detonates the social contract, it happens in June of 1975.
The Rodrigazo?
Exactly. Historically known as the Rodrigazo, named after the Minister of Economy at the time, Celestino Rodrigo. And, calling the Rodrigazo a mere policy failure that completely misrepresents the historical record.
Yeah, it was way more intentional than that.
Right. This was a calculated, devastating shock plan designed to shatter the existing social pact and force a massive realignment of the country's wealth.
And the impact of that shock plan is just staggering when you look at what it did to daily life. Like, imagine you were just a regular citizen trying to feed your family, right? You wake up one morning and the currency, the peso, has been absolutely decimated. The Rodrigazo triggered a massive devaluation that sent inflation skyrocketing from what was a relatively manageable 24%.
Which is still high, but manageable.
Right, but it jumped from 24% up to a devastating 182% in a single year.
And that inflation hit the core necessities of daily survival instantly. The state mandated a 180% hike in the cost of fuel, transportation, and basic public services practically overnight.
Wait, overnight? So your commute to work suddenly costs almost triple what it did yesterday.
Literally triple. Your utility bills triple. Your wages by maybe a third of the groceries they used to.
It's suffocating.
It effectively stripped the working class of their purchasing power, and by extension, their fundamental dignity. The economic whiplash was so severe, it just paralyzed the nation.
And that triggered a massive historical milestone, didn't it? The labor union stepped in.
Yeah, the General Confederation of Labor, the CGT, which is the massive umbrella labor union in Argentina, they called for a 48-hour general strike.
Which is a huge turning point. I mean, this was the very first time a Peronist government faced a general strike of this magnitude from the very unions that traditionally form the absolute backbone of the Peronist movement.
Exactly. It proved that the administration's impotence was undeniable. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, this chaos wasn't just an accident of bad governance.
Right. Conservative internal sectors, spearheaded by groups like the Argentine Rural Society, they actively weaponized this chaos. They were openly denouncing the government as Sovietizing the country.
They were deliberately inviting an iron-fisted alternative. They essentially pointed at the burning building and demanded someone come in and enforce order. They were cultivating the vacuum.
It feels less like a natural disaster and much more like a controlled demolition of a building's foundation.
That's a really good way to put it.
You weaken the support beams, you plant the explosives, and when the building inevitably collapses, you just throw your hands up and say, well, we had to tear it down. It was structurally unsound.
Exactly.
So if the conservative sectors in the military essentially helped manufacture this intolerable chaos, was the economic collapse of 1975 basically a Trojan horse to justify a dictatorship?
Oh, absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, creating an intolerable present is the oldest playbook for justifying authoritarianism. You cannot present yourself as the savior of a nation if the nation doesn't believe it's dying. And while the civilian leadership was collapsing under this engineered economic stress, the military was undergoing a massive tectonic shift internally to prepare for their role as the savior.
They were cleaning house, essentially.
Right. There was a systemic purge within the barracks. Military officers who believed in the constitutional order, the officers who believed the military should always remain subordinate to an elected civilian government.
The ones known as the integrated professionals, right?
Exactly. Those integrated professionals were methodically purged or sidelined.
And they were replaced by a completely different breed of officer. Men like Jorge Rafael Videla and Roberto Viola.
Yeah, these were the dispensable professionals. They completely rejected the idea of constitutional subordination. To them, the military was an autonomous, supreme arbiter of the nation's destiny.
So they formed this totally coup-ready general staff.
Yes, and by the end of 1975, the logistical plans to seize the state were already finalized.
And they were operating with a very specific geopolitical tailwind, too. Right? I mean, the Cold War is dictating global foreign policy at this point.
Oh, absolutely. The United States is watching this instability in Argentina and viewing it as a massive threat to regional interests.
Right. So with the subtle, discreet encouragement of figures like U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the Argentine military prepared to step in.
And they didn't frame their upcoming intervention as an illegal coup. They framed it as the only civilized solution to a state of absolute anarchy.
They basically painted themselves as the adults entering a room full of unruly children.
Exactly. Because the foundation of the country had been intentionally destroyed in 1975, the actual takeover in 1976 didn't look like a chaotic, bloody street battle. It looked like a cold, surgical, administrative operation.
Which brings us to the night of March 24th, 1976, the beginning of what the regime officially named the process of national reorganization.
That night inaugurated a super-constitutional era, and we really have to pause on that term.
Yeah, super-constitutional, meaning the military statutes, the new decrees issued by the junta, were explicitly placed above the national constitution.
Yes, above the very foundational law of the land.
Wait, let's look at the term they use for themselves, though. National reorganization. That sounds so clinical.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds harmless, like rearranging the furniture in the living room or organizing a filing cabinet. They sold this to the public as a moral cleanup, a return to administrative order. But considering they immediately declared themselves super-constitutional, wasn't this essentially the assassination of the rule of law on day one? I mean, they weren't reorganizing the state, they were replacing it entirely with themselves.
You're exactly right. The term reorganization was a deliberate linguistic shield meant to mask the complete dismantling of the republic. And the execution of the coup itself proves how methodical this replacement was.
They didn't just roll tanks to the presidential palace and start shooting blindly.
No, not at all. They surgically extirpated the leadership of the old order. For example, Isabel Perón is flying in the presidential helicopter, expecting to go to her official residence.
Right.
But the pilot unexpectedly diverts the aircraft to the metropolitan airport, Aeropark. And there, she is met by General Jorge Rafael Videla and formally placed under arrest.
Wow. But the president was really just the head of the snake, because simultaneously the military unleashed an incredibly sweeping dragnet they called Operation Bag, or Operation Bolsa.
Yeah, they decapitated the entire political and union leadership in one fell swoop.
About 400 people were arrested that night.
Right.
Politicians, prominent union leaders like Lorenzo Miguel, powerful, influential figures across the spectrum, and they didn't just put them in a local jail.
No, they detained them on a ship, the 33 Orientales.
Which is such a crazy detail to me, putting them on a ship.
It's a profound psychological and tactical maneuver. Think about it. It physically removes them from the geography of the city. It severs their communication lines instantly.
And it prevents any of their followers from rallying outside a municipal jail to demand their release. You can't protest outside a boat anchored in the water.
Exactly. In a matter of hours, the structural capacity for any resistance was neutralized.
And into that total power vacuum steps the new absolute authority, the military junta, a triumvirate representing the three branches of the armed forces.
We have Lieutenant General Jorge Rafael Videla representing the Army, Admiral Emilio Eduardo Massera representing the Navy, and Brigadier General Orlando Ramon Agosti representing the Air Force.
And the contrast between their public propaganda and their immediate actions is just glaring. They issue this act for the national reorganization, proclaiming a moral mandate to fix the country. They tell the public they are combating corruption and demagoguery.
But in reality, they instantly dissolve the National Congress and every single provincial legislature. They promise to eradicate subversion and restore peace.
But their first act of peace is to completely remove the Supreme Court and replace it with 5 hand-picked civilian loyalists.
Right. They tell the workers they are going to recover the productive apparatus of the nation, and then they militarily intervene in the labor unions and entirely suspend the constitutional right to strike.
So the legal framework of a democracy is vanished literally overnight. But, and this is where it gets even more insidious, to sell this reorganization to a deeply Catholic country, they needed more than just guns. They needed a divine veneer.
The military wanted to project an image that they were restoring Western and Christian values.
The proximity of the Catholic Church hierarchy to the junta is one of the most chilling conspiratorial elements of the takeover. I mean, we see figures like the papal nuncio, Pio Laghi, the Pope's diplomatic representative in Argentina.
Yes, and Pio Laghi wasn't merely a passive diplomat. He was a known member of the secretive P2 Masonic Lodge, right alongside Admiral Massera.
Wait, really? The Pope's representative and the head of the Navy were in a secret lodge together.
Yes. Secret meetings between the military high command and the ecclesiastical hierarchy ensured the regime could promise the public a God-given recovery. They basically co-opted the moral authority of religion to bless an apparatus of state terror.
That is horrifying. Because once that legal framework was dismantled, once the Supreme Court was theirs and the Constitution was suspended, the regime faced a massive logistical problem. They needed a way to control the populace, but they couldn't simply execute dissidents in the town square. Public executions spark international outrage.
Right, they create undeniable visual evidence that ruins the civilized image they promised foreign investors and the U.S. State Department.
And if you publicly execute a political opponent, you create a martyr. You give their family a body to mourn, a grave to visit, and a clear focal point for their anger. It provides closure, and anger built on closure can organize into a rebellion.
Exactly. So they chose a different method. They moved from a traditional dictatorship into what's known as a bureaucrato-authoritarian state. And in the system, terror isn't just a byproduct of the military being in charge. Terror is the central administrative function of governance.
It's how they manage the citizens.
Yes. And this leads to the strategic choice of disappearance. The word desaparecido becomes a terrifyingly common noun.
It creates this total paralysis of ambiguity.
Hmm.
Like if someone is grabbed off the street by men in civilian clothes driving unmarked Ford Falcons and they just vanish, the family is trapped.
They don't know if their loved one is dead or alive.
Right. They don't know if filing a habeas corpus or protesting will actually sign a death warrant for the victim. It just isolates every single family in their own individual bubble of fear.
And on the international stage, it provides the ultimate bureaucratic shield. Plausible deniability.
Oh, right, because there's no body.
Exactly. When foreign governments or human rights organizations ask about the missing people, the junta just shrugs. They claim ignorance. They suggest the missing people fled the country or, went underground to join guerrilla groups.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When you look at the architecture of how this terror was built, it's incredibly bureaucratic. It is like a dark, inverted corporate structure.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't just commit crimes. They built an entire administrative supply chain for human erasure. They divided the entire country into 5 distinct military zones, zonas 1 through 5.
And the commanders of these zones were granted absolute, unquestioned autonomy. They operated like feudal lords possessing the power of life and death over anyone within their borders.
And underneath these commanders were the task forces, or grupos de tareas, clandestine squads of military and police personnel just hunting down targets.
And they took these targets to a massive network of secret detention centers, over 500 of them across the country, hidden in plain sight.
Wait, 500 in plain sight.
Yeah, in military bases, police stations, even converted garages. 2 of the most notorious were the ESFMA, the Navy Petty Officers School of Mechanics, which was located right in the middle of a bustling neighborhood in Buenos Aires and Garage Olimpo.
That's just the idea that people are going to work and grabbing coffee right next door to a torture center. It's chilling.
It is. Inside those walls, the ultimate goal of the bureaucratic authoritarian state was achieved. Victims were transformed into non-persons.
Stripped of their names.
Yes, assigned numbers, subjected to systematic torture, and ultimately marked for elimination.
And the scale of this machine is something that remains a massive battlefield of memory in Argentina today. Understanding the human cost requires looking at 3 distinct data points to comprehend the debate over the numbers impartially, based on our source material.
Right. First, you have the official records compiled immediately after the dictatorship ended by the CONADEP Commission. They documented approximately 8,960 highly detailed, individually verifiable cases of disappearance.
But then you have a second piece of evidence that exposes the sheer scale of the cover-up. Internal intelligence cables from the DNA.
The Chilean secret police.
Right, who were operating in coordination with Argentina through Operation Condor. These cables date back to 1978. And in these secret cables, the intelligence officers themselves acknowledged to their superiors that 22,000 people were already dead or disappeared.
And that was only by 1978. The dictatorship operated for another 5 years after that cable was sent.
Exactly. Which leads to the third figure. Human rights organizations, most notably the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, have historically maintained the figure of 30,000 disappeared.
Because this number contemplates the vast, unrecorded scale of the clandestine apparatus, it accounts for the families who were entirely wiped out, leaving literally no one behind to file a report.
And the victims who lived in marginalized areas, outside the scope of official documentation, it stands as the historical, symbolic truth of a decimated generation.
And this vast machine of terror was sweeping up anyone deemed a threat to the Western and Christian reorganization. It wasn't just armed guerrillas.
No, it was union delegates, student leaders,
Yeah.
journalists, and specific minority groups. The persecution was intensely systematic. For instance, the Jewish community in Argentina suffered disproportionate victimization.
The anti-Semitism within the military apparatus was deeply entrenched. Jacobo Timerman, a prominent Jewish journalist who was kidnapped and tortured by the regime, later famously compared the silent complicity of the DAIA, which is the umbrella organization of the Argentine Jewish community, to the Judenreich of the Nazi era.
Wow.
It is a devastating commentary on how overwhelming state fear forces community leaders into impossible compliant positions just to survive.
And the regime's moral crusade also targeted anyone who defied traditional social structures. LGBTQ plus individuals were specifically hunted by a unit called the Commando Condor.
Even religious minorities weren't spared. Jehovah's Witnesses were routinely tortured simply because their faith forbade them from bearing arms.
Because to the military mindset, refusing to hold a rifle for the state was an unforgivable act of subversion.
But of all the systematic crimes committed during this era, the most grotesque, the most profoundly bureaucratic crime was the systematic theft of babies. The robo de bebés.
When pregnant women were kidnapped, or when women became pregnant while in captivity in these secret detention centers, they were kept alive just long enough to give birth.
And this wasn't an isolated incident of rogue guards. Medical personnel actively facilitated this. Captain Jorge Luis Mañaco, a medical doctor, routinely presided over these clandestine births.
Once the child was born, the mother was almost universally murdered. The infant was taken, their true identity completely erased, and they were given sometimes sold to military families or civilian allies of the regime.
They didn't just steal the lives of the parents, they stole the identities and the futures of the children. It is the final, absolute act of state-sponsored theft.
It really is.
And, turning victims into non-persons fundamentally breaks the psychological fabric of a society. When a state apparatus steals a baby and hands it to a military family, they're essentially declaring, we own life itself. We own your biology. We dictate who exists and who does not.
It traps the surviving biological families in a perpetual state of agonizing limbo. You're unable to grieve a death that was never confirmed, and unable to find a child hidden behind a forged birth certificate.
Exactly.
It is an incredibly heavy reality to process, but we have to understand that the violence of the task forces operating in the shadows was actually a shield.
Right.
It was a brutal silencer that allowed the regime's civilian allies to execute a massive social war in broad daylight. They were waging war through the economy.
This is a crucial pivot. Enter the Minister of Autonomy, Jose Alfredo Martinez de Hoz. He is the central architect of the dictatorship's economic policy.
And his mandate was to implement the neoliberal economic models of the Chicago School.
But this wasn't merely about balancing budgets or fighting inflation. Economic policy under Martinez de Hoz was explicitly weaponized as a tool for social discipline.
Okay, let's follow the logic of that social discipline. If we think back to the Rodrigazo in 1975, it was the massive power of the labor unions that completely paralyzed the state. The military and their civilian corporate allies realized that as long as Argentina had a massive, thriving industrial base, there would be millions of factory workers. Millions of factory workers inevitably organize into powerful unions. And powerful unions mean a constant existential threat of strikes and political opposition.
That's the core of it.
So if you want to break political opposition, you don't just ban the unions, you destroy the factories they work in. Is that why Martinez de Hoz pushed deindustrialization so aggressively?
That is exactly the mechanism. The deindustrialization of Argentina wasn't a tragic accident of bad macroeconomic policy. It was a deliberate structural choice to liquidate the political power of the working class. They actively enacted tariff policies and financial deregulations that forced major industrial plants to close. General Motors, Citroën, Chrysler, massive manufacturing hubs were just shut down.
And when those plants close, the workers lose their jobs, the unions lose their membership base and their funding, and the political power of the working class is effectively erased from the national equation.
Exactly. And what did they replace that industrial economy with? They ushered in the era of the plata dolce. Sweet money.
Sweet money. This was built on two key mechanisms introduced in 1977, right? The Financial Entities Law and a currency manipulation system known as La Tablita.
Right. The Financial Entities Law completely deregulated the banking sector. It made it incredibly easy to move capital in and out of the country without oversight, while simultaneously propping up domestic interest rates to artificial highs.
And then you add La Tablita. Let's break down the math of how this manipulated society. La Tablita was a system of scheduled, pre-announced devaluations of the Argentine peso. The government published a literal table telling investors exactly how much the peso would be worth against the US dollar months in advance.
It completely removed all the risk from currency speculation.
Right. So imagine a working-class factory worker who just lost their job because the local auto plant shut down due to the new economic policies. They are struggling to buy bread. Meanwhile, across town, a wealthy investor can borrow millions of US dollars cheaply from a foreign bank.
Right.
They bring those dollars into Argentina, convert them to pesos, and put those pesos into a deregulated Argentine bank, earning massively high artificial interest rates. Because of La Tablita, that investor knows exactly what day the currency will be devalued.
Down to the exact day.
So the day before the drop, they pull their massively inflated pesos out of the bank, convert them back to U.S. dollars at the guaranteed exchange rate, pay back the initial foreign loan, and pocket a fortune in pure profit. Then they move that profit to an offshore account.
It was a risk-free casino for the elite. I mean, think about it. Why would a wealthy individual ever build a factory, invest in machinery, hire workers, and deal with labor rights when they could just park their capital in a bank and watch it multiply magically through financial speculation?
Sweet money. But, a casino doesn't generate real wealth. It just transfers it. Someone has to pay for the illusion.
Always.
The regime paid for this artificial prosperity by taking on an astronomical amount of foreign debt. In 1975, right before the coup, Argentina's total foreign debt was about $7.8 billion. By 1983, when the dictatorship finally collapses, that debt had exploded to $45 billion.
Almost a six-fold increase in less than a decade. And it wasn't just irresponsible borrowing. A federal judge, Jorge Rafael, later investigated this massive debt accumulation. He legally classified it not as bad economic policy, but as a criminal operation.
Because towards the end of the regime, they executed the ultimate grift. They took all the private debt that these wealthy corporations and individuals had racked up through their financial speculation, and they nationalized it. They transferred the gambling debts of the billionaires onto the shoulders of the Argentine taxpayers.
The state assumed the private debts. And what's fascinating here is that this massive engineered transfer of wealth gave birth to a new permanent elite termed the patria contratista, or the contractor fatherland.
These were massive corporate conglomerates that absorbed the wealth generated by the dictatorship's economic engineering. They thrived on lucrative state contracts and the socialization of their private losses.
The growth is undeniable. Look at the Macri Group. In 1975, the Macri Group consisted of 7 companies. By 1983, shielded by the regime's economic policies, they had grown to 46 companies.
They grew exponentially while the rest of the nation's industrial base was systematically dismantled. So, if the wealth stayed with these civilian collaborators after the military left, didn't the dictatorship actually succeed in its ultimate economic goal?
What's fascinating here is that this reveals the most painful, enduring truth of this era. Military regimes eventually fall. Generals grow old and are eventually put on trial or die in prison. But the structural economic changes they engineer—
The decimation of the industrial base.
Right, the concentration of corporate power into conglomerates, the crushing multi-generational burden of foreign debt, those things become permanent fixtures of the subsequent democracy. The military may have been evicted from the presidential palace, but the economic architecture they built remained largely intact long after they were gone.
It's a sobering thought. But a regime can't fund a massive clandestine war and a casino economy forever. To maintain this massive illusion of economic prosperity, to keep the plata dulce flowing from foreign banks, and crucially, to hide the industrial scale of state terror occurring in those 500 detention centers, the junta needed absolute control over the narrative.
They needed a silencer for the domestic culture and a massive megaphone for the international stage.
And the domestic silencer was ruthless. The regime viewed culture not as an expression of art, but as an active battlefield. They believed that subversive germs were hiding in books and songs and movies.
Their quest for cultural homogeneity resulted in an absolute purge of the national soul through Operation Clarity, Operation Claridad.
This was the state-sponsored hunting of intellectual opposition. The most visceral, heartbreaking manifestation of this operation happened in the town of Serendi. The regime confiscated books from a massive publishing house, the Centro Editor de America Latina. And they didn't just ban them or lock them in a warehouse. They burned them in an empty lot. 1.5 million books. A literal pyre of human thought.
It is the ultimate symbol of an anti-intellectual authoritarian regime. If you control the material people can read, you severely limit the concepts they can think about. They created extensive cultural blacklists, effectively erasing the most resident voices from the public sphere.
Like who?
The legendary folk singer Mercedes Sosa, the internationally renowned author Julio Cortázar, the poet and songwriter María Elena Walsh, brilliant actors like Luis Brandoni and Hector Alterio. They are completely banned from television, from radio, from publishing.
The censorship wasn't just aimed at specific people, though. It was aimed at the mechanics of language itself. They banned words like proletariat and Latin America because they sounded too Marxist. But the most revealing censorship was their ban on the word dialogue.
Banning the word dialogue tells you everything you need to know about the psychology of their governance.
They also banned the teaching of modern math in schools, which sounds absurd, but it's true.
The ban on modern math is fascinating from a psychological perspective. Authoritarianism requires absolute binary thinking. Right versus wrong, patriot versus subversive. The pedagogical concepts of set theory, or the idea that there are multiple equally valid ways to solve a single mathematical problem that inherently threatens a regime built on the idea that there is only one correct reality dictated by the state.
They wanted absolute, unquestioning obedience, even in arithmetic.
Exactly.
They also completely banned national rock music, rock national, from the radio airways, viewing it as a vector for rebellious youth culture. Until, of course, they desperately needed it later on during the Malvinas War, when they cynically promoted Argentine rock just to replace the English language music they had suddenly banned.
Right.
But while they were suffocating the domestic culture, they needed a massive distraction for the rest of the world.
And the universe handed them the ultimate propaganda shield, the 1978 FIFA World Cup. Hosting a global sporting event provided the perfect cover. The junta poured unimaginable resources into organizing the tournament, spending between $500 and $700 million.
That was nearly 10 times the original budget, incredibly rife with corruption and zero transparency. But to the junta, it was worth every single penny. They weren't building stadiums for sport. They were buying a colossal international image-washing operation.
And the PR machinery behind this was incredibly sophisticated. They didn't just rely on their own military propagandists. They secretly hired a massive American public relations agency, Burson Marsteller.
An American agency operating within a dictatorship to professionally clean the regime's image. Think about the media you consume during major sporting events. How easily can spectacle blind us to reality?
Very easily. Burson Marsteller's mandate was to counter what the junta called the anti-Argentine campaign, which was simply the accurate international reporting on their human rights abuses.
The agency advised the military to never mention terrorism, never mention human rights, just project an image of a progressive, peaceful, and stable country to foreign investors and journalists.
And the regime went into overdrive. They issued Secret Directive Number 1, a naval document outlining a comprehensive plan to exploit every single event surrounding the World Cup to spread favorable news.
They went so far as to set up a pilot center in Paris, specifically to monitor and disrupt Argentine exiles in Europe who were trying to organize a boycott of the tournament.
Yes. And they crafted incredibly manipulative slogans. The most famous was a play on words. Los Argentinos somos derechos y humanos. Translating to, we Argentines are right and human, but playing on the phrase derechos humanos, human rights. They weaponized the language of their critics to mock them.
The complicity of the domestic media during this spectacle was total. Major private media conglomerates acted as willing news factories for the military. Editorial Atlantida, which published massively popular magazines like Rente and Somos, published glowing headlines about a country that changed, right next to glossy photos of General Videla celebrating the goals in the stadium.
The propaganda even crossed the line into outright, undeniable fabrication.
The fake letter?
Yes. The sports magazine El Gráfico published a letter supposedly written by the captain of the Dutch national team, Ruud Krol, addressed to his daughter. In this completely fake letter, Krol supposedly tells his daughter not to worry about all the bad things she's heard about Argentina because the rifles here only shoot flowers.
The rifles here only shoot flowers.
Wow. Krol later completely denied ever writing it. It was pure fiction, designed to convince the Argentine public that even the foreign stars thought the country was a paradise.
But the most haunting aspect of the 1978 World Cup is what's called the ESMA paradox. It's like turning up the volume on a stereo to drown out a scream next door. The main stadium for the World Cup, the Estadio Monumental, where the final was played, where tens of thousands of people were screaming in joy. It's located just a few blocks away from the ESMA.
The Navy School of Mechanics, the largest, most brutal clandestine detention and torture center in the country.
You have the roar of the crowds, the confetti, the celebration of the goals, and just blocks away, human beings are shackled to walls, being tortured. Survivors of the ESMA have testified that from their cells they could clearly hear the roar of the stadium.
They could hear their country celebrating while they were being systematically destroyed.
The regime has so completely isolated the victims that society could literally cheer just down the street from a torture chamber.
But the strategy of using a global spectacle ultimately contained the seeds of the regime's own exposure. You cannot host a global event without inviting the global press. Thousands of foreign journalists flooded into Buenos Aires.
And while they were there to cover soccer, many of them noticed something the domestic media had been ordered to ignore. Women with white headscarves marching silently in the Plaza de Mayo.
The mothers of Plaza de Mayo. These women were demanding to know where their disappeared children were, and the mechanics of their protest are brilliant.
Because the regime had strictly banned public gatherings of more than 3 people. So the mothers couldn't just stand in the square and hold signs.
Right. Instead, they walked in pairs, silently circling the Pyramid de Mayo monument in the center of the square. Because they were constantly moving, they weren't technically gathering, they were just walking. They subverted the regime's own bureaucratic rules.
And the foreign press gave the mothers an unprecedented global megaphone. That sudden, intense international visibility pierced the regime's carefully crafted bubble.
The diplomatic pressure mounted so intensely that the following year, in 1979, the junta was forced to accept a visit from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the CIDH.
And the CIDH gathered thousands of testimonies and published a devastating report that officially documented the systemic terror. The wall of silence was finally cracked.
But a regime can only survive on borrowed money and PR spectacles for so long. By the early 1980s, the sweet money era had completely collapsed. The artificial prosperity evaporated, the massive foreign debt was suffocating the economy, unemployment was spiking, and the first massive civilian protests organized by the rebuilding labor unions were starting to hit the streets.
The junta's PR shield was completely shattered. They needed something much stronger than a World Cup to distract a starving, furious public. They needed the ultimate nationalist trump card, a war.
And the decision to go to war in 1982 was not a sudden, isolated act of madness by the junta. It was the culmination of an established doctrine. They had actually tried to play this exact card a few years earlier.
In 1978, right?
Yes. Amidst rising internal tensions, the regime mobilized the military and was mere hours away from launching Operation Sovereignty, an invasion of the islands in the Beagle Channel, which would have started a full-scale war with Chile.
And that conflict was only aborted at the very last minute due to the personal mediation of the Pope. But it proved that the junta's default mechanism for fixing internal crises was to manufacture an external war.
Fast forward to 1982. The economy is in ruins. General Leopoldo Galtieri is now the head of the junta. On April 2nd, he launches an invasion to recover the Malvinas Islands, known in English as the Falkland Islands, from British control.
It was designed as a nationalist reset. Reclaiming a territory that every Argentine believed was rightfully theirs would, in theory, instantly wipe away the sins of the dictatorship.
And for a brief, fleeting moment, the manipulation worked. The same crowds that were violently protesting the military government just days earlier were suddenly filling the Plaza de Mayo, cheering for Galtieri.
But the reality of the war on the ground starkly exposed the profound corruption and incompetence of the military apparatus.
The military had spent the last 6 years fighting unarmed civilians in the shadows. They were completely unprepared for a conventional logistical war against a global naval power.
They kept their best, most highly trained troops stationed around Buenos Aires or near the Chilean border to protect the regime from internal threats. And who did they send to the islands? 19-year-old conscripts.
Kids. Conscripts who were entirely unprepared for the brutal, freezing conditions of the South Atlantic. They lacked proper winter gear, they lacked adequate food, the logistical supply lines were an absolute disaster.
And horribly, these young soldiers frequently suffered field punishments at the hands of their own superior officers. The exact same officers who had learned to torture civilians in secret detention centers were now abusing their own freezing, starving troops.
It's horrific. And while these kids were starving in trenches, the domestic propaganda machine was running at full speed. Magazines like Gente and Somos plastered newsstands with headlines screaming, "Estamos ganando! We are winning!"
The government completely controlled the flow of information, feeding the public a steady diet of fictional victories. They claimed British aircraft carriers had been sunk and that British troops were retreating in terror.
Even when massive tragedy struck, they spun it. The sinking of the cruiser ARA General Belgrano by a British submarine was a devastating loss. 323 Argentine sailors died in that single event.
That's nearly half of all Argentine casualties in the entire war. But the propaganda machine kept insisting that ultimate victory was inevitable, which is why the final surrender on June 14, 1982, was such a massive traumatic shock to the Argentine public.
They woke up one morning and realized that everything they had been told for the last 2 months was a complete lie.
It feels like a massive miscalculation. Did the junta actually believe they could beat a global naval power? Or were they just so insulated by their own propaganda that they believed their own lies?
This raises an important question about the fatal flaw of authoritarian regimes. When you spend years systematically eliminating every single dissenting voice, burning books, banning the word dialogue, and surrounding yourself entirely with sycophants, you eliminate the very people who could warn you that you are making a catastrophic mistake.
Oh, I see.
The junta had constructed such a perfect echo chamber of their own supreme power that they genuinely convinced themselves the British wouldn't fight back, and that the United States would support Argentina over its oldest NATO ally. They fell victim to their own manufactured reality.
And that humiliating defeat in the South Atlantic incinerated whatever tiny shred of legitimacy the regime had left. The illusion of the omnipotent military was completely shattered. The economic ruin was undeniable. The bodies of the young conscripts could not be hidden forever. The country finally demanded a reckoning.
But the cruelty of the regime extended even to the aftermath. The military leadership initiated a process of demalvinization. When the surviving conscripts finally returned to the mainland, there were no parades. There were no heroes' welcomes.
The military actively hid the returning veterans. They brought them back at night, kept them sequestered in barracks, and ordered them not to speak about what they had endured.
They wanted to hide them because the broken, starving bodies of these young men were living proof of the regime's absolute strategic and moral bankruptcy. The generals didn't want the public to see what their glorious war actually looked like.
But the transition back to democracy in Argentina is unique. It wasn't a negotiated compromise where the military dictated the terms of their exit.
No, it was a transition without submission. The military was far too disgraced to impose conditions or grant themselves blanket amnesty before leaving power. On October 30, 1983, the country holds free elections, and Raúl Alfonsín is elected president.
Alfonsín campaigned on a very specific mandate, ending the disappearance of justice. He promised that the rule of law would return and that there would be structural accountability. He took immediate, historic steps, starting with the creation of the CONADEP, the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons.
This was a truth commission composed of respected civilian figures, led by the famous author Ernesto Sabato. Their mandate was to investigate the fate of the disappeared.
They traveled the country, gathering thousands of agonizing testimonies from survivors, witnesses, and families. They compiled all of this horror into a monumental report titled Nunca Más, Never Again.
Nunca Más wasn't just a book. It was the definitive empirical unmasking of the bureaucratic authoritarian state. It proved, with undeniable evidence, that the disappearances weren't excesses committed by a few rogue officers in the heat of battle, but a systematic, top-down plan of extermination orchestrated directly by the junta.
And that report laid the groundwork for one of the most important legal events of the 20th century, the 1985 trial of the juntas.
This trial set a massive global precedent. This wasn't a Nuremberg situation where victorious foreign powers set up an international tribunal to try the leaders of a defeated nation.
Right. This was a domestic civilian court putting its own former dictators on trial for crimes against humanity under its own national laws.
It proved that the democratic state had the power to judge those who had believed themselves to be super-constitutional. The trial was a daily public exorcism of the nation's trauma. Survivors stood in court, face-to-face with the generals who had ordered their torture, and testified on the record.
It culminated in the closing statement by the lead prosecutor, Julio César Stracera. He didn't end his argument with legal jargon. He ended it by speaking for the entire country. He said, "Señores jueces, nunca más. Judges, never again."
And it resulted in historic convictions. General Videla and Admiral Massera, the absolute architects of the terror, were sentenced to life in prison.
So what does this all mean? Justice wasn't a clean Hollywood ending, was it? It was messy, it took decades, and it required relentless civilian pressure.
The road to actual lasting accountability is rarely a clean straight line. The military apparatus was wounded, but they still had guns. Following the 1985 convictions, mid-level officers began staging violent uprisings, threatening a new coup if the trials continued to target the lower ranks.
They're essentially holding the fragile new democracy hostage.
Yes. Under that immense military pressure, the civilian government caved. They passed the impunity laws. the obediencia debida, due obedience, and punto final full stop laws.
These laws effectively halted the trials, legally arguing that lower-ranking officers were merely following orders and could not be prosecuted. It was a massive, devastating blow to the victims.
And it got worse in 1990 when the new president, Carlos Menem, issued presidential pardons that released even Videla and Massera from prison, claiming he was trying to pacify the country by burying the past.
But you cannot mandate reconciliation by burying the truth. The human rights organizations refuse to accept this impunity. The resilience of the civil society becomes the true engine of justice.
The mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo never stopped marching. They never stopped investigating. They never stopped demanding accountability.
That relentless civilian pressure eventually broke the dam. In 2005, the political climate has shifted, a new generation had come of age, and the Argentine Supreme Court finally struck down those impunity laws, declaring them unconstitutional.
The trials were reopened. But this time, the courts began prosecuting the systematic extermination as an act of genocide. Hundreds of perpetrators, from generals down to the doctors who stole the babies, were finally put behind bars where they belonged.
It proves that the memory of the disappeared could ultimately outlast the power of the military state. The grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, utilizing painstaking genetic testing, have managed to locate and restore the true identities of over 130 of those stolen babies, who are now adults.
Every time they find a grandchild, it is a definitive biological victory over the regime's attempt to erase them.
While a dictatorship can burn millions of books, they cannot permanently burn the desire for truth. We have synthesized an incredibly complex history today based on our sources. We started by looking at how an economic crisis was manufactured to make the public desperate for order.
We saw how the military dismantled the state to install a bureaucratic authoritarian regime, utilizing the commodification of fear and economic looting to restructure society.
We explored the cynical use of the World Cup as a propaganda shield, the catastrophic gamble of the Malvinas War, and the fierce ongoing fight for truth and justice. Today, March 24th, is no longer a day of military pride in Argentina. It is the National Day of Memory for Truth and Justice.
It is a day dedicated to national reflection on the fragility of democracy.
The institutions we rely on, our courts, our constitutions, our press, are not magical shields. They are only as strong as our collective willingness to defend them. When a society becomes polarized, when economic stress makes people desperate for strongman solutions, the architecture of authoritarianism can be assembled much faster than we think.
And the tools of manipulation have only grown more sophisticated since the era of Burson Marsteller and fake magazine letters.
In 1976, the regime had to physically burn 1.5 million books in an empty lot to control the narrative. They had to explicitly ban words like dialogue because they understood that memory and language are the greatest threats to authoritarian power. Today, we live in an era of unprecedented information overload. We live in algorithmic echo chambers that can filter out dissenting voices without us even realizing it.
Where rewriting history doesn't require a national magazine, it just takes a few clicks and a bot network.
In our modern era, where censorship isn't about hiding information but drowning it in the sea of noise and algorithmic manipulation, how do we ensure that our own societies don't slowly start erasing the words and the memories that keep us free?
How do we prevent the subtle, controlled demolition of our own foundational structures?
Just remember the image we started with. The sudden, violent storm might be terrifying, but it's the quiet, bureaucratic engineering in the shadows that you really need to watch out for. Thank you for joining us on this intense and vital deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will see you next time.